Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we're continuing our trifecta of chocolate, part 2.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So on today's show, we are going to continue our discussion on chocolate. On the first show, we discussed where chocolate came from, how it was made, the path it takes to become the chocolate that we all love. And today, I'm going to get to the basics of how we should properly handle chocolate, because there really is a way to handle it well and to handle it poorly. And some of you may have had some incidences, I should say, in the kitchen where things have not turned out very well. I know I have. So we can, we're amongst friends. We can all talk about it out loud and maybe compare some notes. So the first thing, chocolate needs to be treated very gently, especially when it comes to a recipe that asks you to melt the chocolate. You want to treat it gently. Some people will take their chocolate, put it in a container, throw it in the microwave, and just blast it. And then they can't understand why their chocolate looks like burnt carbon, because they scorched it. And their microwave was a lot more powerful than they really anticipated. So the first thing you really must know about handling chocolate is treat it gently. If a recipe calls for it to be melted, that means low and slow. Low temperature when heating it, and just give it time to melt. Now, you can melt it in the microwave. I should not say you can't. I do not melt chocolate in the microwave. Honest, I'm telling you the truth, I do not. You can successfully do so if you really know your microwave in and out, and you know just how many seconds on what power and what strength you need to melt your chocolate. But I don't recommend it. Different chocolate manufacturers and have different amounts of cocoa butter in them, and they will vary. So if you switch brands and you pop in the microwave, you could really ruin your chocolate. Not only scorch it, but there goes, some bucks that you just paid for some chocolate, and it's not cheap, and now you got to buy more. So the first thing I would recommend is to use a double boiler to melt it. If the recipe says melt chocolate by itself, on its own, solo, this is the easiest way to melt it. Fill a saucepan with about 1 to 1.5 inches of water. Bring it to a boil. Remove it from the heat. Put the chocolate that you wish to melt into a heat-proof bowl. Now, again, it's going to be stainless steel. It's going to be tempered glass, anything that's heat-proof. And put your chocolate in that bowl. And again, the bowl itself should not be too small that it is going to fall into the saucepan of water. You don't want it to touch the water. It should be big enough that it's cradled by the top of that saucepan. The bottom of that bowl should never touch that water. What you're melting the chocolate with is the steam that is produced from the boiling water over that's touching the bottom of that bowl, that top bowl, and you're just allowing your chocolate to sit and melt gently. And you can stir it every once in a while, but that's the first thing I do. If a recipe says melt some chocolate, I will do that first. That's the first thing. Even before I preheat my oven, I will actually get that chocolate to melting. Now, if a recipe calls for butter to be melted with the chocolate, so you have an additional ingredient with the chocolate, you can place both the butter and chocolate into a saucepan and melt them without a double boiler, low heat, and really watch it. Don't leave, and stir. You don't want to rush the process. I still sometimes use a double boiler for this. I still do it. But the rule of thumb is melting chocolate by itself, do it in a double boiler. Melting chocolate and any other ingredients, usually you're okay to put it in a saucepan directly over low heat. So let's have a discussion about that beautiful fat that we all love in chocolate. We brought up on the last show, cocoa butter. Cocoa butter. So this is a delicious, delicious fat, and that's the reason why we love this high quality chocolate. We love that cocoa butter. That's what makes it taste so velvety smooth. But it's also posing a conundrum. Cocoa butter is difficult. It's a little temperamental, all right? So we have to be careful about what we add to chocolate because sometimes the cocoa butter doesn't like it. So if, let's say you go and you are putting your chocolate, you're melting it, you've made your double boiler, all right? You've gotten your pot of water on the stove. It's come to a boil. You take it off the heat, and your bowl of where you're going to put your chocolate has a drop of water in it. You didn't thoroughly dry it. You are going to be in big trouble because if you put your chocolate in that top bowl and you put it over that heat, it's going to do something, and you'll remember it, but I'll tell you what it's called. It's called seizing. Seizing. S-E-I-Z-E. It's going to seize. And seizing is never a good thing when it comes to chocolate. Usually it involves you throwing out that chocolate and starting again. An expensive thing to do. So when chocolate seizes, it usually has been exposed to a couple of drops of water, and it can get into the chocolate, and it really starts getting granular and stiff, almost like hard chalk, and it basically becomes unusable. And you have to chip it off your pot. This is just from one little drop of water. If the chocolate's melting nicely and water drips into it, this is what's going to happen. So why is this happening? What is this phenomenon called seizing? And it does happen. There's a natural starch in chocolate, and it resists mixing smoothly in with liquids. And it's all about the amount. If it's a drop of water, you'll get seizing. If you add much more water, it won't seize. You can make a chocolate sauce with a little water or milk directly in with the chocolate, but it's got to be more than a drop. So you have to be super careful. Now, the general rule is it should be about 1 tablespoon of water for every 1/3 cup of chocolate. It won't seize if you do that. But a drop here or there, that's a problem. That is a problem. The starch in that chocolate's going to just suck in that water, and it's going to start this stiff, chalky texture from forming. And it's a disaster, folks. I've done it. It is a disaster. I mean, I've been in tears because I have to start again. And you may not have enough chocolate to start again. So it's a problem. The other thing I want to bring up along the same lines is when you are melting chocolate and you lift that top bowl off that hot water, remember the water that has melted your chocolate through the condensation and through the steam from the bottom pot, you want to wipe it off with a towel or a kitchen towel or a paper towel. Wipe it and dry it before you pour that chocolate into other ingredients. Because once you get that melted chocolate off of that pot, what's going to happen? You can have beads of condensation on the bottom of the bowl, right? And if you pour, what's going to happen to the condensation? They're going to roll towards the chocolate. And you're going to allow that water to be introduced to the chocolate. So always dry it off. It's a little tip. It's a trick, but it will help you actually attain the best batters and the best chocolate concoctions in your baked goods. So the other thing we want to discuss, remember the Wicked Witch of the West? Remember water destroyed her? Think of chocolate sort of like the Wicked Witch of the West, but a lot of water destroyed her. Here, only a drop will do the trick, and we don't want to do that. So let's talk about something that we're going to talk about in the next show. I'm just going to bring it up very, very briefly. Cocoa butter. Cocoa butter has fat crystals in it, and they are known as fat crystals. And there's different types. There's an alpha crystal. There's a beta crystal. I'm not making this up. There's a beta prime crystal, and I'm not going into more detail about that. But there is something where these crystals can become stabilized, and this is known as tempering. And you've heard of chocolate tempering. Any chocolate you purchase in the store, no matter what store you purchase it in, a chocolate store, a grocery store, it doesn't matter, a candy store, it has been tempered. It has been tempered. So that when you break it, if you've ever broken a bar of chocolate, it breaks with a snap. And that snap really shows that those cocoa butter crystals have been stabilized. And it's a combination of melting down the chocolate, slowly cooling it a little bit, and really trying to factor out just certain crystals. And you really want to highlight just those crystals. Those are the most stable at certain temperatures, especially at room temperature, because most chocolate is not refrigerated. And I don't recommend you refrigerate your chocolate because there's humidity in a refrigerator and your chocolate can get damaged. So tempering can be very tricky, even for the expert chocolate handler. And I am not an expert chocolate handler. I'm the first to admit it. You can buy chocolate temperers that can actually get your chocolate tempered. Chocolate manufacturers, candy manufacturers will have temperers, big machines that will temper the chocolate. Keep it at a certain temperature so that when it does cool, it will break with a snap. Most households do not have this. Most home bakers do not. They do have small tempering machines that you can purchase. I do have one. And you can even temper by hand by putting your chocolate, melting it, cooling it, and then reheating it. It can be tricky. And if it's a hot day, if it's a humid day, it can throw everything off. So I don't recommend you try it at home. But there are ways you can get around not having to temper your chocolate. So chocolate that's going to be mixed in with other things, like a brownie recipe, you don't need to temper that chocolate. You're going to melt it down. You're going to mix it with butter. You're going to mix it with eggs and flour and sugar and bake it. Chocolate cake, no need to temper. The way and the reason you need to temper is when you're going to serve that chocolate on its own. So let's say you're going to serve chocolate. You're going to make, let's say, a candy, like a caramel, and you're going to dip that caramel into chocolate, and you're going to leave it at room temperature. That chocolate would need to be tempered, or you would need to use a special chocolate known as compound chocolate. And I'm going to go over that even in our next show. That will be more stable because it doesn't use cocoa butter. It actually has vegetable shortening in it that will harden at room temperature and not need refrigeration. If you are going to make little candies, like chocolate dipped strawberries is a perfect example. If your strawberries are not thoroughly dried, you will get some of this seizing up on the chocolate because you'll melt your chocolate. You dip, those gargantuan strawberries by the stem into the chocolate, and you must dry those strawberries thoroughly, and then you put them on a sheet pan. And sometimes you'll get some beads of moisture around the chocolate, or it'll look streaky, almost like it's got white streaks in it. It's going out of temper. And what happens is if you keep it in the refrigerator, it should be okay. But if you leave it at room temperature, it will go out of temper and start looking sort of strange. It'll get chalk-like. It'll get crumbly. It will be not like chocolate you want to eat. So again, we don't want to talk about actually tempering chocolate. But if you mix chocolate in with other ingredients, it's not necessary to temper it. Just know that. The other thing we want to talk about is something known as bloom. Bloom. Now, you may think of blooming. We talk about blooming with two things in the kitchen: blooming chocolate and blooming gelatin. And blooming gelatin is when you take unflavored gelatin, you mix it in with a cold liquid because it's very granular, and you let it soften. It's also known as blooming it. Maybe you've heard of that. Chocolate bloom is very different. This is when chocolate is actually left, maybe at the wrong temperature. Maybe it's been exposed to humidity and the wrong, completely wrong temperature. And it will start looking funny. Like you'll look at it and say, what is wrong with this chocolate? It looks like it has fungus growing on it. I don't mean to be ugly. But it will have a whitish color to it, almost like it's getting, damaged in some way. It's like it's been powdered, like with powdered sugar or powder, actual powder. So what is that? What happens? What is happening here? It means that it's slowly going out of temper. So it's been exposed, like I said before, to maybe various temperature changes. Maybe the temperature in your kitchen got super hot, your air conditioner broke, and then all of a sudden it got super humid, and then it got cold again. This can make this happen. It's a little unsightly, but it doesn't mean the chocolate's bad. If you want to melt that chocolate, put it into a chocolate cake recipe or a brownie recipe or a frosting recipe, go ahead. It will be fine. Now, if your chocolate is old, if it's over a year old, it will develop this bloom as well. And sometimes it can have an off flavor. So after many months, if you notice this bloom, try a little piece. It's not going to kill you, but try a little piece. If it tastes off, discard it. Okay, and get yourself some fresher chocolate, newer chocolate. But if it stays on the shelf, and the whole purpose of chocolate is that it is shelf stable, it has been tempered by food, by the chocolate manufacturers. If it is whitish looking, it's just got that little bloom. Like I said, try a little bit. If it tastes off, discard it. If it tastes fine, keep it. But I would use it soon. All right, so that's your chocolate bloom discussion. Now, we have to discuss combining chocolate with other ingredients. This is where things get a little dicey. So, melting chocolate and getting it in to other ingredients can be tricky. And I've had lots of experience with this, both professionally when I worked as a pastry chef in restaurants and personally at home. Chocolate, if you mix melted chocolate, remember it's melted, so it's going to be a little warm. If you mix melted chocolate in with cold ingredients, you're going to end up with chocolate chips. So this is what I did once. I took heavy cream, I whipped it, and then I folded melted chocolate into the whipped cream, thinking I was going to make chocolate flavored whipped cream. Well, what I got was whipped cream with chunks of chocolate in it. And it was ugly. It was delicious, but it was ugly. So you really have to be careful. If you really want that smooth chocolate whipped cream, you have to do it in a certain way. Because again, it's this darn cocoa butter. It's so temperamental. All right. It's a very sensitive ingredient to deal with. So again, we talked about cold ingredients making chocolate seize. You really have to do it in a certain way. So let's say you want to combine melted chocolate and whipped cream. Whipped cream has to be kept cold. The heavy cream, if it's not cold, we actually had a show on whipping cream and how to make the perfect whipped cream. And you can't do it unless the cream is cold. But chocolate doesn't like it to be cold, especially if it's melted. So we have a dichotomy of temperatures. What to do. So what you're going to do is you're going to sort of work around it. There's workarounds. And that's why if you do have a recipe for chocolate mousse, if you have a recipe for chocolate whipped cream, you're going to have to follow the recipe really carefully. Don't diverge. Don't go off on your own and say, oh, I'll do it this way. Don't do it. They're telling you a certain way for a reason. So you're going to melt the chocolate with just enough liquid. Maybe it'll be some of the liquid whipped cream, the cream that hasn't been beaten to a whipped, consistency yet. You're going to take some whipped or heavy cream, unwhipped, and maybe let it get to room temperature. Melt it with that melted chocolate. Whisk it together really well to loosen up that chocolate. Loosen it up. Come in between all the chocolate, and then whip the rest of your cream to stiff peaks, and then fold in your melted chocolate and cream mixture, and that will work a lot better. Your whipped cream, your chocolate whipped cream will be smooth and creamy. It will be a little loose. It won't be as stiff as you would expect, but if you put it into little containers or cups or on top of a cake, however you want to serve it, it will be fine. It will actually chill and firm up. Chocolate, cocoa butter is solid at room temperature, so it will go back to its original state and firm up. Not a problem. But you must be careful about cold ingredients and putting melted chocolate into them. It can be tricky. So again, pay attention, take a look, and see. So today we learned how temperamental chocolate is, specifically the cocoa butter. The cocoa butter is the key ingredient that can be very, very sensitive to anything we want to do with it. So we must treat it with kid gloves. We learned about seizing, we learned about blooming, and we learned about how to add melted chocolate into different temperatures of ingredients. So if you have any questions about this program, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer some of your questions on air. And if you've enjoyed this particular episode, part 2 of chocolate, hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to leave a review, I'd greatly appreciate it. On the next show, it's part 3, chocolate again.